My daughter stole $10,000 and ran away with her boyfriend, who was 10 years older than her, to another state, to his house. I got home from work and saw my 17-year-old daughter, Emily, wasn't there. Her shoes, backpack, and favorite hoodie were gone. My wife called her phone, no answer. It was off. Her friends hadn't seen her since the day before. By morning, the school said she hadn't been there. She'd run away a few weeks before Emily disappeared. We had a huge fight about her new boyfriend, Jake. She'd met him over the summer, and by fall, she was obsessed. He was 27, 10 years older than her, and lived in a rundown apartment across town. He didn't have a steady job, just picked up odd work here and there, and his family barely got by. Jake introduced an unhealthy lifestyle, and he hung out with a rough crowd, guys who looked like they'd been in and out of trouble. Emily didn't see any of that. She'd come home talking about how he was misunderstood, how he had a good heart underneath it all. She said he loved her, and she was the only one who could help him get his life together. I couldn't stand it. I told her she was 17, still in high school, and not some hero who could fix a grown man's problems. Jake wasn't her responsibility, he was an adult who'd made his choices. I pointed out he was using her, that a guy his age going after a teenager wasn't normal. She'd get quiet, then argue back, saying I didn't know him like she did. She insisted he needed her, that she could save him from his bad habits and his messed up life. I kept pushing, telling her she was too young to see it clearly, that she'd fallen for a loser who'd drag her down. It went on like that for days, yelling, tears, her storming off to her room. I thought I was getting through to her, but she'd just sit there, staring at the floor, not saying much after a while. Looking back, I should have seen she wasn't really listening. She was already too far gone, wrapped up in whatever fantasy she'd built around him. That fight set the stage for everything that came next. After days of arguing about Jake, Emily finally seemed to give in. It was a Sunday morning, and we'd just finished another round of me telling her she wasn't Jake's savior and her insisting she could change him. She looked exhausted, with dark bags under her eyes, like she hadn't slept in days. I laid it out again. She was a teenager, not a therapist or a life coach, and Jake was a grown man who'd chosen his path. I told her she deserved better than some guy who couldn't even take care of himself, let alone her. I repeated that she was 17, still in high school, and had her whole life ahead of her. Why waste it on someone who'd already thrown his away? She didn't fight back this time. Instead, she nodded, eyes fixed on the kitchen table, and said she'd break it off with him. She promised she'd stop talking to him altogether, that she'd block his number and focus on school instead. I felt a weight lift off my chest, like maybe I'd finally gotten through to her. Jen was there too, sitting across from Emily, and she backed me up. She told Emily she needed to think about her future, college, a career, not about fixing Jake's problems. Emily didn't argue with that either. She just agreed, quietly, and said she'd handle it. Then she got up and went to her room without another word. I thought it was over. For the next few days, she acted normal. She left for school each morning, came home on time, and sat at the dining table doing her homework. She didn't mention Jake once, didn't even hint at being upset. I started to relax, figuring she'd kept her promise. One night, while she was in the shower, I checked her phone, not proud of it, but I needed to be sure. There were no texts or calls from Jake, no sign of him anywhere. I told Jen about it, and she agreed Emily seemed different, calmer, like she'd let go of the whole mess. We didn't bring it up again, not wanting to push her when she was finally acting reasonable. I let my guard down completely, convinced the worst was behind us. That promise was all I had to cling to, and I believed it was real. I didn't realize she'd just gotten better at hiding things, that she was only saying what I wanted to hear. Looking back, I should have seen the signs. She was too quiet, too agreeable. But I didn't. I thought I'd won. When really, she was already planning her next move. A week after Emily's promise, she didn't come home from school. It was a Monday, and she'd left that morning like usual, backpack over her shoulder, saying she'd be back by 3:30 p.m. I got home from work later that day and noticed the house was empty. Her shoes weren't by the door, and her room was untouched since morning. I called her phone, no answer, just voicemail. I texted her, asking where she was, but got nothing back. By 5 p.m., I started to worry. Jen got home soon after, and I told her Emily wasn't here. She tried calling too, same result, straight to voicemail. We figured maybe her phone died, or she'd stopped at a friend's house, but it didn't feel right. Jen called the school to see if they knew anything. The office said Emily hadn't shown up that day at all, she'd skipped every class. That's when panic set in. Jen called a few of Emily's friends, but none of them had seen her. I started thinking about Jake, wondering if she'd lied about breaking things off. Jen called his number next, hoping he'd pick up and tell us something. He didn't answer. The phone just rang and rang until it cut off. I paced the living room, running through every possibility. Maybe she was hurt, lost, or worse. Jen sat on the couch, phone in her hand, calling anyone she could think of, teachers, neighbors, even Emily's old babysitter from years ago. No one had any idea where she was. Hours passed, and the house stayed silent. I checked her room again, looking for anything, a note, a clue, but found nothing new. By 9 p.m., I couldn't wait anymore. I called the police and reported her missing. I told them about Jake, how he was older and trouble, and that I thought she might be with him. They took the report and said they'd start looking. That's when it hit me, she hadn't just wandered off. She'd run away with him, breaking her promise without a second thought. After calling the police, I sat in the living room, trying to piece things together. Jen was still on the phone, talking to anyone who might know something, but I couldn't focus on that. My mind kept going back to Jake, where he lived, what he might have said to pull Emily away. Then I remembered the cash I kept in the house. I'd been saving up for a new furnace, stashing $10,000 in a lockbox under my bed. It wasn't something I checked every day, but with Emily gone, I had a bad feeling. I went upstairs, pulled the box out, and opened it. Empty. Not a single bill left. I stared at it, hands shaking, realizing she'd taken it. I called Jen over, showed her the empty box, and told her Emily must have grabbed the money before she left. She didn't believe it at first, said Emily wouldn't do that, not to us. But the proof was right there, or rather, it wasn't. The lockbox wasn't broken. Emily knew where I hid the key, in my desk drawer. She'd planned this, gone through my stuff, and taken every dollar. I told the police about the theft when they called back for more details. They asked if Emily had access to cash or cards, and I explained about the $10,000, how it was gone now, probably with her and Jake. They added it to the report, runaway and theft, and said they'd look into Jake's last known address, a place a few hours away in another state. I sat there after, staring at the empty box, feeling betrayed. She didn't just leave, she stole from us to fund whatever she was chasing with him. Jen stopped making calls and just sat next to me, silent. We didn't know what to say. The money was a punch to the gut, but knowing Emily chose Jake over us hurt worse. All I could do was wait for the police to find her. The police took the report and started looking for Emily that night. They asked for her picture, her phone number, and everything we knew about Jake, his full name, his age, where he might have gone. I gave them his address from a few months back, a shabby apartment complex 2 states over, where he'd lived with some friends. I'd driven by it once when I tried to check him out after Emily started seeing him. The cops said they'd contact local authorities there and see if he still had ties to the place. They also asked about the money, how much it was exactly, and if Emily had ever taken anything before. I told them it was $10,000 cash, and no, she'd never stolen from us, not even $1. They nodded, wrote it down, and said they'd treat it as a runaway case with possible theft involved. Jen gave them a recent photo of Emily from her phone, one she'd taken at a family picnic a month earlier. The police left around 11 p.m., promising to call with any updates. After they were gone, I couldn't sit still. I kept thinking about Emily out there with Jake, that money in his hands, and what he might do with it. Jen tried to sleep, but I stayed up, checking my phone every few minutes. The next day, the police called and said they tracked Jake's phone signal to a town 3 hours away, near his old address. They were working with the state police there to narrow it down. I asked if they'd found the money, but they didn't have an answer yet, just said they'd let us know when they located her. Waiting was brutal. Every hour felt like a day, and I kept picturing her in some rundown house with him, spending what we'd worked hard to save. The police were doing their job, but it didn't feel fast enough. 2 days after Emily disappeared, the police called with news. They'd found her at Jake's place, a small house just outside the town they'd tracked his phone to. It was a rental, barely standing, with peeling paint and a yard full of junk. The state police had gone there after a neighbor reported seeing a young girl matching Emily's description. When they knocked, Jake answered, and Emily was inside with him. She didn't try to run or hide, just sat there on a beat-up couch while they questioned her. The cops said she looked tired but unharmed, still wearing her hoodie from home. They took her into custody and arrested Jake for questioning, since she was a minor and he'd crossed state lines with her. By the next afternoon, they brought her back to us. A patrol car pulled up to our house, and Emily stepped out, head down, escorted by an officer. Jen ran out to hug her, but Emily just stood there, arms at her sides, not saying a word. The officer explained they'd found her with Jake, but the $10,000 was gone. Emily admitted she'd given it to him, and he'd already spent it. She didn't fight them when they picked her up, just went along quietly. I asked the cop what happened to Jake, and he said they were holding him for now, looking into charges, but nothing was set yet. Emily came inside, sat on the couch, and stared at the floor. Jen asked her why she did it, but she didn't answer. The police left after giving us a case number and saying we'd hear more later. She was home, safe, but it didn't feel like a win. The money was gone, and whatever trust we had was shattered. All I could think was how she'd chosen him over us, and now we had to figure out what came next. Once Emily was back home, things didn't go back to normal. She stayed quiet for days, mostly in her room, only coming out to eat or use the bathroom. Jen tried talking to her, asking what happened at Jake's, why she took the money, but Emily just shrugged or said she didn't want to talk about it. I couldn't look at her without feeling angry. She'd stolen from us, lied about breaking up with him, and ran off without a thought. The police called a day later with an update. They'd interviewed Jake, and he admitted the $10,000 went to fixing his car. He'd blown it all on parts and labor for some beat-up truck he'd been driving. There was no way to get it back, cash was gone, receipts were vague, and he didn't have anything worth that much to seize. They charged him with contributing to the delinquency of a minor, but said the theft was harder to pin on him since Emily gave him the money willingly. He was still in jail, waiting for a hearing, but it didn't matter to me, he'd already cost us enough. I asked Emily about the car repair story, and she nodded, saying it was true. She didn't explain why she thought it was worth it, just sat there looking blank. Jen wanted to ground her forever, take her phone, lock the doors, but I didn't see the point. She was 17, almost an adult, and punishing her wouldn't undo what she'd done. We told her she'd have to get a job to help pay us back, even if it'd take years. She agreed, but her voice was flat, like she didn't care. The house felt heavy, like none of us knew how to move forward. Emily was physically back, but the daughter we knew wasn't. Jake had taken more than the money, he'd changed her, and us, for good weeks past, and life settled into a tense routine. Emily got a part-time job at a fast food place near school, working weekends to start paying us back for the $10,000. She handed over her paychecks without complaint, but it barely made a dent, $50 here, $70 there. At that rate, it'd take her a decade to cover it, and we all knew it. Jen stopped pushing her to talk about Jake or what happened. It was clear Emily had shut that part of herself off. She went to school, worked, came home, and stayed in her room. No friends came over, no phone calls, nothing. The police closed the case after Jake took a plea deal, 6 months probation for the minor charge, no jail time. The theft didn't stick since Emily admitted she gave him the money, and he'd spend it all anyway. I didn't care about him anymore. He was out of our lives, and that was enough. The empty lockbox still sat under my bed, a reminder of what we'd lost, not just the cash, but the trust we'd had in her. Jen and I argued more, about how to handle Emily, about what we could have done differently. We never found an answer. Emily turned 18 a few months later, and she started talking about moving out, getting her own place once she saved enough. I didn't fight it. She'd already shown she could leave when she wanted. The money was gone for good, sunk into Jake's truck, and we'd never see it again. Looking back, I realized she'd been lost to us long before she took it, back when she decided he was worth saving. She was home, but the damage was done. We'd keep going, but it'd never be the same.